Your Excellency, thank you for taking the time for us and our entire OMNI News family.
It's my pleasure.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. Throughout the interview, we're going to have different questions from our different colleagues at OMNI News. And we will begin with the historic visit to the Vatican of the Indigenous delegations and the pending visit of Pope Francis to Canada. Madam Governor General, Pope Francis delivered this long-awaited public apology regarding Indian residential schools. You said that an apology is a step on the road to reconciliation, but it's just that. It's one step, and it has to be backed by action. What kind of action are you hoping to see from the Pope during his visit to Canada and as a consequence of that visit?
Well, first of all, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that the Pope has made an apology, and he's also planning to come to Canada this year, and will continue his dialogue with Indigenous people and leaders. So I think the delegation that went to Rome to see the Pope, His Holiness, made a significant step forward by, first of all, having discussions with His Holiness, and also being able to sit with him while he made his apology. The apology is significant in the road to reconciliation because it was the Catholic churches and governments that created the unfortunate situation that Indigenous peoples are in today, and that is through the residential school system. A lot of former students were victimized in these schools, and it has been long called for, the apology from the Pope. People have been working on it for many years. So the fact that he made this apology is an important step. It's an acknowledgement that there have been wrongs of the past and that they need reconciliation. So the step in terms of reconciliation is part of that. Part of that is, first of all, acknowledging and expressing the sorrow and the hurt that was caused. And secondly, I think when you start talking about what is going to happen after an apology, you have to make sure that it's meaningful. It's not just words. So you need action behind those words. And I think that once the Pope has been to Canada, and the continuation of perhaps an apology here on the lands of Indigenous people will occur. I don't know it for sure because we don't know that much about it at this point, but there's a real desire from the Indigenous community to have the Pope do the apology in Canada. Reconciliation is a way of life, and part of that life that we are leading now is that we're at a cornerstone in the history of the relationship with the churches and the governments, where we want to move forward and get past the pain and the hurt. But first of all, that apology has to take place. Action means working together, learning to respect one another, giving space to Indigenous people on their lands, and also recognizing that Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of this country. And then you get into a lot of different things. You can enhance the education system for Inuit and other Indigenous people. You can enhance other services related to Inuit. You can also enhance those relationships with all Indigenous peoples, and it's a continuation of work so that the apology doesn't just stand on its own. That's what I mean by when I say that that one of the steps that we have to take now and in the coming years is to work together to reconcile the past and to have a much better relationship amongst different peoples, especially with Indigenous people.
Would you like to see the Pope delivering an apology on the grounds of unmarked graves?
Well, it's not really for me to have any determination in that, but I think what's important is that Indigenous people help identify where the Pope is going to make an apology, if and when he does make it. And it'll be really important for the Pope and his people to work with leaders of Indigenous communities to determine where the most sacred place is, both in the West, in the East, and in the Arctic. So these are things that people are working on right now. I think it's significant if the Pope were to go to one of the former residential schools where the unmarked graves have been found. For him to go there would be very, very significant.
The Indigenous delegation went to the Vatican at the heart of their pain, suffering, intergenerational trauma. There was criticism of the Catholic institution, which should understand that apologies are offered, not asked for. Do you think it's a valid criticism and an important one to acknowledge?
It hasn't been offered, and Indigenous peoples have called for the apology for many, many years. I mean, I can remember 25 years ago when people were asking, and it has taken this long to get to this stage. So offering an apology is not something that we have known. We asked the federal government for an apology, and there was an apology made, and we accepted the apology, and we wanted action behind the apology here in Canada. And also, I think when you look at what's happening now with the Vatican and the progress that is being made towards probably a very significant event in Canada, then the criticism may be there, but it's the result that's important. And that's how Indigenous people see it.
Madam Governor General, you have said reconciliation is getting to know one another better. A key recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission addresses newcomers to Canada. Our next question on this theme comes from our Filipino news producer, Marie Pacheco.
The DRC stated that many immigrants are not aware or educated about the complex history of Indigenous peoples. Fair to say there is a lack of understanding on the years of colonization, policies, systemic discrimination, and residential school system. A two-part question. How concerned are you that newcomers may be having negative or damaging stereotypes about Indigenous peoples? And are the new Oath of Citizenship and the yet-to-be-completed New Citizenship Guide for Immigrants important and effective educational tools?
First, I just want to say that it's not just new Canadians or immigrants that have moved and made Canada their home that are not aware of what happened historically. A lot of Canadians don't know what the history of the country is because it was never taught. It was never talked about. So education, when it comes to the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with other Canadians, is something we all have to work on. It's not something that just started when immigrants started to come to Canada. It comes from very historical parts of the relationship. So it's really important to understand that education in terms of who Indigenous people are in this country, why they are considered and are the original people of this land. I think there's a lot of education that is required. We have to teach it in our schools. We have to make sure that the history books of Canada reflect the true history of the country. And when that happens, I think all Canadians, especially the younger generation, will learn about the history and will probably understand much better the relationship that has evolved over hundreds of years. And immigration is an important part of Canada's development. And we welcome people that make Canada their home. So we are very much a diverse, inclusive, we want to make it more inclusive, but we live in a very diverse culture, a diverse country. So I've made one of the priorities of my mandate is to make sure that we address diversity and inclusion, and that relates to people that have made Canada their home and have immigrated to Canada. I think by developing a better understanding and giving space to people that have their own culture and their own language, not just Indigenous peoples, but there are many people in Canada that have different cultures that speak their own language, and we should encourage that. It should be something that as a country we embrace the cultures and the identity of different cultures and also their languages. I always encourage people, like in my own community, where I come from, we encourage people to speak Inuktitut so that we don't lose it. Because if you don't use it and speak it, you lose it over time. And I encourage all cultures in Canada to be able to do that. And I think it enriches the country. And I speak this way because I come from a place where we weren't allowed to speak our Indigenous language. And thankfully I had a home that spoke the language all the time, and our community spoke the language all the time. So, you know, I'm one of the fortunate people that's bilingual, not in terms of two official languages, but in my own language and in English, and I'm learning French. So hopefully I'll be trilingual someday.
Thank you, Madam Governor General. We will be back with more of our conversation with Governor General Mary Simon after this break. Welcome back to our conversation with Governor General Mary Simon, continuing on the theme of understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. A question from Arabic language reporter Farah Mustafa. The question reflects the spirit of a truth and reconciliation recommendation on education and understanding of Indigenous people history among new Canadians.
OMNI Arabic has done a story with a Palestinian-Canadian architect Rami Kayalo, who has been working with the people of Ganawagi First Nation Reserve to build a guest house, which will host visitors and make activities that aim to bridge the gap between Indigenous and new immigrant communities. How would you characterize the value and the impact of these grassroots projects and the role they play in moving us closer toward reconciliation?
Any grassroots activity is very important to move reconciliation forward. I think the project that you're talking about and the initiative, it is an illustration of how Indigenous peoples reach out to bring other cultures into their place of living and place of work. And doing it through educational initiatives, I think, allows people whether you're an adult or a child or a youth, to be able to talk to one another in a way that brings the understanding that is so necessary for me to be able to listen to your, let's say, your stories, or for you to be able to listen to my stories and to understand who I am. And grassroots initiatives do that. So I think it's extremely important that these types of initiatives take place.
In April, you visited Gababa Machakwe Wandering Spirit School, which provides Indigenous students with an opportunity to learn about Anishinaabe cultural traditions and empowers them to be future leaders with a strong cultural identity. Our next question comes from our Cantonese and Mandarin reporter, Jolene Tiang, on language and culture.
Yes, the promotion and celebration of language and culture is very much important to our Chinese communities in Canada. So what is your vision and hope for the promotion, the development, and also the resurgency of Indigenous language and culture in Canada?
Indigenous language and culture is the root of our identity. And because of that, it's extremely important to make sure that it's vibrant, it's healthy. And unfortunately, some of that has been lost through the colonization and the residential school process. And therefore, we really have to work hard to, bring some of it back into our own communities, and to make sure that the youth are learning their cultural and language identities. Because I think there are times when you look back in history and see how languages have been lost. And a lot of it is due to the fact that either you're forced not to speak it, or people decide not to use it. And I think that's how one loses one's language. So it's really important to understand that as a community, as a country, we need to work together to protect, enhance our Indigenous languages. Language is part of our culture. It really illustrates, like for us, the Inuit, our language is very tied to our culture. So it's really important to continue that relationship between our culture and our language. But unfortunately, some of our people have lost the language because of residential school and the way they were taken away from their homes. So therefore, there's a lot of work that is needed in our country. And as a result of that, I think it's incumbent on not just the people themselves, but governments to support the Indigenous languages in Canada. And now we have a commission, language commissioner that's been established, and hopefully through that we can do a lot more work.
Thank you, Madam Governor General. We'll be back with more of our conversation with Governor General Mary Simon after the break. Welcome back to OMNI News Special and our conversation with Governor General Mary Simon. There are many challenges facing Indigenous youth, and we'd like to focus on the theme of education and employment. Our next question comes from Eden Debebe, a member of the OMNI Digital team.
According to Stats Canada, 44% of the Indigenous population is under the age of 25, and a hot topic on many young people's minds right now is employment. Despite some improvements made over the past 5 years, there are still significant gaps in the employment and unemployment rate of Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. With many factors to consider, including socioeconomic, education rates, and geographical location, what can be done to better support Indigenous youth in entering the workforce?
I think, first of all, I should say that education is a right. Every child is entitled to education. So whether we do it through education that is unified for all youth, or we can also have special schools. So it's one of those things where I think teachers and the education system should embrace even more in terms of bringing in different cultures and getting children to talk about who they are and learning to understand who their friends are, how, you know, why they are who they are. And that relationship can evolve into becoming a youth. And I really believe that that is the foundation of young people beginning to understand why we say Canada is such a diverse country. Diversity, we say diversity is very important. It is very important, but we have to live it and understand it, and to be able to understand each other and give the space that's needed. For employment, I think everybody has the right to employment, and everybody should have equal opportunity to employment.
The devastating impacts of climate change are everywhere. Wildfire, melting sea ice, severe weather. Our next question comes from our Punjabi language reporter, Anurit.
Last year, world leaders pledged to slash greenhouse emissions by setting targets, but to the convenience of each nation. We are living in a paradoxical age where we are charging electric vehicle with power generated by fossil fuels. In trying to tackle climate change, it seems like many have forgotten the wisdom of our ancestors to live in harmony with nature. Indigenous people across the globe and other ethnic communities have been living very close to nature. They were self-reliant for their basic needs. How can Canada look back to the lessons and teachings of these communities as we look for the creative solutions for climate change?
This is happening more and more. Indigenous people are becoming more involved in climate change issues, and I think looking after nature and the environment is a key component of Indigenous cultures. And as a result of that, it's really important to show that this is a humanitarian issue. It's not so much a political issue, it's more of a humanitarian issue. And when it comes to our people in the north, it's like climate change is having such a severe impact on our lifestyle, the hunting, because we're on the land people. We have to hunt and we have to fish for our food because the cost of living is so high up north. And this is just an example of how climate change, which is not something that we have created, is having such a severe impact on our lives. So it's really important for us to continue telling this message to the world community, that the world community needs to understand that what is happening in the Arctic is having an impact in other parts of the world, or vice versa, you know. And I think traditionally our philosophy has always been only use what you need. Don't overuse the environment or the living conditions that we have, or even to the point of saying that when you go out hunting or fishing, you only take what you need because you have to come back for more. So environmental issues is a really important part of our livelihood, really.
Your Excellency, briefly, a few closing questions. The discovery of unmarked graves, I'm going back to the first theme, will this be a turning point, a tipping point for Canada and Canadians?
It has been a tipping point. I think when the unmarked graves were discovered in Kamloops, it was like an awakening in the country. People did not realize that this was actually something that happened in Canada. Even though it was in reports, people don't often read reports, and because it was visual, it was in the media, people for the first time actually realized that this was happening in had been happening in their own backyard. So it has been an awakening, and it has really created a new way of addressing what happened to residential schools. And perhaps that has had an influence on everything that's happening now, even with the Vatican.
You mentioned the Vatican. Should there be a healing circle at the site of unmarked graves where the Pope and Indigenous people can maybe heal together during his visit in Canada?
Again, I can't really speak for what they're going to be doing, but any kind of healing ceremony would be extremely important for Indigenous people, especially with former residential schools. We don't have so many survivors anymore, but for those that are left, this is a really important time in their lives, and any kind of healing ceremony is going to be a very important aspect of the Pope's visit.
On behalf of our diverse OMNI News teams, I would like to sincerely thank you for your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.